Welcome to Talaterra, a podcast about freelance educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. Who are these educators? What do they do? Join me, and let's find out together. This is your host, Tania Marien. Today my guest is Michi Mathias. Michi is an illustrator, author, and educator who creates informational illustrations to help people teach complicated concepts. She has written and illustrated short graphic narratives, a booklet about the science moments we experience every day, and a fun interactive comic about a day in the life of a freelance professional who is trying to get kids to school on time while getting work done. It is written in a choose-your-own-adventure type of format and is a lot of fun. How did Michi begin her illustration and graphic novel practice? How does she find the story in her projects? How does she illustrate for behavior change? Let's find out. Welcome, Michi. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, thank you so much, Tanya. It's an honor to be asked. It's a pleasure to be here.
When I met you in one of the groups that we belong to, and I went and explored your website, I said, oh my goodness, I need to speak with Michi. Because I love the way that you use illustration to help people teach others. And that's the way that you use illustrations to describe and explain all sorts of different topics, from science education to recipes to history, and so we'll be able to talk about all that in our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've always really liked explaining stuff, and I've been told in the past, even as a kid, that I was kind of good at it. Just a kind of the way my mind works, I guess, a certain organization, and I find a visual way of explaining things is just a really good way that people can take in information at a glance that would take an awful lot of words to get the same thing across, or maybe you'd get bored halfway through anyway trying to read it. So it works for me. That's just how my mind works.
Well, I can tell you it works for us on the outside watching and learning from you as well. So let's begin our conversation talking about your life as a freelance professional. How did your illustration and graphic novel practice begin?
Oh boy, this is a very unusual and convoluted route to get here, I think. I mean, I didn't go to art school. I'm one of these people that drew all the time as a kid, and I know a lot of people do that and then sort of stop for one reason or another. I guess I carried on pretty much up into my very early 20s, and I was always the one in the room that would get asked to, make a poster or bumper stickers or business cards or whatever for people. In the days before computers made it possible for everyone to just knock these things up on various graphics programs. And then somehow I just completely stopped drawing. And I didn't mean to. I didn't realize I had until much later, but looking back on it, I think I was pretty bored with my own style, because I used to aim for, just really tight realism, and you can never, well, at least, some people can, but I could never achieve that. And I think I just kind of thought, what's the point? Or I don't know. As I said, it's not a conscious thing, but I just realized, I basically hadn't drawn for a very long time. So it's only really quite recently that I got back into it. 2013 is the year that my 18-year-old son was going off to university, my older son. And I really wanted to send him away with some home cooking recipes. He's, at the time, and maybe even still now, he really didn't like reading stuff on paper. And I thought, I'm just going to sketch these out for you. Just basically drawing the ingredients with arrows where they go, very, very minimal instructions. And partway through doing this, he said, "Oh, that's okay, Mum, I don't need anything like that." But by this time, I'd shown it to a few other people, the sort of drafts. And a lot of people were saying, "Boy, that's, I'd love to have that myself. And, you should do more." And even more surprising, people said, "I love your style." I didn't know I had a style because you can only draw the way you draw. And, to the person, that is just the only way there is. That's just what I do. I can't really see it as a style, particularly. But it was very, very encouraging. And I ended up self-publishing a little collection, originally black and white, and a few years later I self-published another collection in color this time. And yeah, that was really the beginning of coming back to drawing. And it's led on to illustration jobs. And a few years after that, the following year, I made my first comic. Now, I had never thought that was something I could do. It just never occurred to me that I would to even try, basically. I've always admired certain comics, and I've really liked ones that made a sort of social or political point. But what happened is I happened to be in a large shop, and I saw a product for sale that really, really annoyed me. It was something that just shouldn't exist in the world. And I came home and I drew a comic about it. Mm-hmm. It was my first one. It was 2 pages. It took forever, but I was using a character in the comic to sort of, how to put it? I mean, she's taking a wrong view. Instead of me banging on about this over and over, to anyone that would listen, I just thought, I'm going to have this character saying things that are obviously wrong. And you can see why they're wrong, by looking at the comic. Anyway, it's a little bit hard to explain, and this doesn't really make very good listening material, I suppose, trying to describe something on paper. But anyway, I enjoyed doing it a lot, and I thought, this is, what I've always really wanted to do. And people got the message. So that was the beginning of making comics.
Fascinating. So you were you worked as an illustrator before this at some point in your career?
No, I don't, back in the very early days, I'm not sure I ever actually got paid, or if I did, it was for very small amounts. It was mostly just being a volunteer. Like, I was doing all sorts of things. At the time I was making, like, I think stationery for people or bumper stickers or business cards or whatever. I think those were probably the days when I was working with Greenpeace as a volunteer, and then later on staff. And so, the illustration was just, it wasn't even illustration, it was just a complete sideline. Occasionally I would do drawing for people if they needed something. So it's only really after doing the recipes that people started to ask, could you illustrate this for me? And it led on from there, which was just a dream come true, really. So little by little, I've got, more and, better, exciting, interesting jobs over the years. What I really like doing, as you said in the intro, is making complex information clear for people. What I most like doing is doing that for people that are doing environmental work or educational work, as well as for people doing good in the world, which sounds very judgmental. And I don't quite know how to say that in a way that doesn't sound really odd. But, other sorts of projects that are ethical or simply people that I like. I mean, I've been very lucky in liking all of my clients so far. It's always felt like doing something, that makes a positive change. And when I say making complex info clear, I suppose people might think of infographics to start with. And in a way, this is a little bit like that, in that it's a graphic way of putting information across. But it's very different because what I do is hand-drawn. It's with fountain pen and usually with watercolor. And when I mentioned before that I'd stopped drawing, and I think because my style was tight and ultra-realistic, or attempting to be, well, when I came back to it, suddenly it was a bit wonky. And I didn't mind. So people describe it as a kind of warm and friendly and even a humorous look to the drawings. So it's quite different from your standard, very sort of square and serious looking infographic. But it's still putting information across in quite a bit of detail. But again, it's a difficult thing to describe in words over the air, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and your work differs from infographics in another way, and that is that there is a story there. Infographics is an organized list of information. That's different from a story.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's usually a lot more to it, and very often, coming up with how to show that story is what takes the longest time. It's not just a question of drawing what a client wants, but it's partly figuring out what they want, because they may not definitely know themselves to start with. They have an idea.
Yeah. So how do you find a story?
Oh, to be honest, usually I'll just try drafting something, maybe the first thing that comes to my mind, just a very, very rough pencil sketch, and send that off, to the clients. And more often than not, it's pretty much what they want, luckily. If it's a complicated thing, there's a lot of back and forth drafting, adding different things in. And there's always a lot of different things to consider. I mean, there has to be a flow to it. It has to make sense. Like, how things are arranged on the page, what you read first, what leads to what. It also has to look nice. As a finished product, it's no good if it just looks like a mess. So it's all and it all has to fit within the size that they want. So it's hard to describe. It really is just a lot of drafting and redrafting and adjusting.
Yeah.
And every job's different, really.
And your process with clients, do you how do you begin your relationship with clients when you are telling their story or describing a message, illustrating a message that they want to get across?
Well, let's see. Usually we might have a phone chat, we might have a Zoom call, sometimes it's just by email, and if at all possible, the client will actually write a brief of what they have in mind. Sometimes I don't get a brief at all because it's very, very vague, and then that's when it takes a lot more discussion. But for instance, I did a job for Zero Waste Europe a while back on an anti-plastics waste campaign, and they gave me lots and lots of statistics that they wanted to come out in the drawing, and it was just simply a matter of finding a way to arrange everything in a way that was readable and had a flow to it and made sense. So, I drafted up a few ideas, sent them off, and they would say which ones they thought were working, and I'd work on them a little bit more and send off another draft. And finally, I'll send off a final ink before I do the watercoloring and make sure I'm on the right track and that there won't be too many changes after the fact. Usually, no matter what, even though you finished it, there will be something at the end, and a client will say, well, actually, I wanted that to say X instead of Y. And I know a lot of people would charge extra for these things at the end, but I really want the client to be happy, and I want the the final job to do its purpose. So within reason, I'm happy to make changes.
Why do you think graphic novels, graphic narratives, comics are so effective as a teaching tool?
Well, a lot of people, I wonder if it's a lot. I know some people are extremely visual, and that's kind of the only way that works for them, much more than words. For people that aren't visual in particular, I've never actually heard anybody say that it was a problem, having the visual. So I think it's something that absolutely works for everybody. And for me, it's the visual and the words are I guess equally important. I mean, my stuff tends to be rather texty because it's all for a purpose. It does contain, enough. Well, okay, the recipes don't, and we'll maybe get back to the recipes in a bit. But when I'm doing a job for a client, there's usually a message that has to come across, and that's not going to happen just through visuals. But I'm someone that really likes words as well. I'm a visual thinker, but I also just love words. I love language. I love editing. And it's a mixture of the two things in a way that everything fits together. And I suppose having the visuals there is something I think your brain just hangs on to it in a different way. And, you take in the information in a different way, maybe deeper.
Mm-hmm. Agree with you there. You mentioned that your narratives have a lot of words. There's a lot of explaining that needs to happen to some extent. You choose your words and the information that you want to get across very carefully. That comes through when you read your work. I was wondering, when the task at hand is to inspire behavior change, how do you approach a project? How do you illustrate for behavior change?
Well, if we go back to my original 2-page comic I did about the offensive product, shall I go ahead and say what it was? Would that make more sense? Okay, this was a so-called baby food maker, and it consisted of a tiny blender attached to a tiny steamer in one plastic machine, which is just so completely unnecessary. Just because it's a baby doesn't mean that you want to make half a cup of food at a time. It's not practical. It doesn't make sense. And if either side breaks, then the whole thing is useless. It's just another silly, electric plastic gadget that is bound to end up in landfill and would only be useful for a very few months at the best of times, even if it lasted. So anyway, I was just so offended by this thing. So I just had a character expounding on all these wonderful features to start with, and then realizing, actually, why don't I just use my own saucepans? And where am I going to keep this in the kitchen? And, what do I do when it breaks? And oh, well, you're just going to go to landfill, but hey, I've kept the economy going. So whether or not, it's my hope that would be a slightly gentle, slightly humorous way, just to get people to sort of think about, is this kind of thing really necessary? But, without cramming it down people's throats.
Yeah.
So you can make the character, be the one who's done the wrong turn. And then talking about it. Another one of my favorite illustration jobs was I did something for the department at the University of Sussex, which was working with traditional cooks in Kenya and finding ways to show people how they could save fuel with modern ways of cooking, like pressure cookers and things like that. Because there's a lot of bean-based recipes, and that takes a lot of cooking. And if you're using, charcoal or wood, you're spending a lot of time cooking, and it's actually quite expensive. So the whole point of this was to show how traditional recipes could be preserved, still honoring, the recipes you got from your mother and your grandmother and people in the community, but making them in a way that saves fuel. And that was a really cool project to be involved in. I did illustrations of all sorts of, beans and different ways of cooking them, different kinds of everything from charcoal burners to, pressure cookers, finished dishes. And we produced a booklet that was handed out to, I'm not sure what the organization was on that side of things, but anyway, it was through the university here. So it was just it's really nice to be involved in things like that feel like they're making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's wonderful. My interest in comic books began when I read an article about how some garden topics are presented in comic books. And the authors of this article argue that comic books can be used to teach children about the environment. And I wrote in a review of the article in a teaching and learning column that I used to write. And at the same time, I came across a book about photosynthesis. And it was this complicated concept taught in a very digestible way. And the main character in this book and in this, there's a larger series with this character. His name was Max Axiom, super scientist, and he did a great job at teaching photosynthesis. and And so, that's the first time that I was clued into the fact that, hey, comic books or graphic novels and that type of a narrative is a good teaching tool. I didn't know that it did that as well.
Right. Yes.
My experience with comic books has always been, Batman style, pow, zoom, that type of thing. and it never, that really shifted how I think about the entire genre.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful how many different things are being expressed now through comics. People are writing sort of autobiographical comics about life experiences that help them work through things they've experienced and can help other people in the same situation, as well as you say, the educational side. All sorts of stories, history. It makes it it's more approachable somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yes.
definitely.
Yeah, and a tool that I've seen used repeatedly in the field of environmental education, I've seen zines, which are mini magazines. And the first zine that I learned about was 2015. And it was an article written in Scientific American on their website. It was written by a scientific illustrator, and she tells a story about how she used zines to engage kids in a summer camp. With all of the wonderful work that you do, I was wondering, do you teach classes about creating graphic narratives for teachers? Or have you ever considered doing so?
Maybe when I've got a few more years under my belt, I might. But I feel like I'm kind of a newbie in all this, really. There's so much more to learn. And, I'm learning more with every job, I suppose, and with every new approach I take. There are people doing that, but no, I haven't yet. Although someone did ask me something like that not too long ago, if I would, teach one of these online course thingies, but maybe someday. Maybe someday. That would be another step.
Do you have any plans to create a science education series? I can totally see you doing this.
I would love to do that. The one little zine that I did make, which was called Up, Down, or Stay the Same, which is just 8 pages, and it was called, I think we called it Fun Science Quiz Puzzles or something like that. And they're basically, well, where it really comes from is they're the kind of questions that my partner would ask our 2 little boys when they were growing up. This is basically questions about science concepts that you can see in everyday life. Real simple things like hard-boiled eggs and holes in buckets and the speed of water coming out. And all of the questions could be answered with either up, down, or stay the same, because it was all about the rate of change or something like that. So anyway, I think there's just about 8 questions in that one. But I love the idea, and it'd be fantastic to do some more.
The examples that you have on your website are a lot of fun. And what I really like about your work, especially this example, and then that wonderful book about the life of a freelance professional, the Choose Your Own Adventure, is that it's interactive.
Yeah.
And that's it, that you you've helped broaden my view about comics and graphic novels, and that you've made it
Right.
interactive. Because you need to check a box. You need to make a choice. You
Yes.
need to,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's fantastic. Your books are fun. Very a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that one was a real, boy, that was a project and a half.
Oh, I bet.
It literally took 15 years from thinking about it to completing it. And it went through a lot of changes. When I first thought of it, it was just going to be all text. Do you remember? You're probably not old enough to remember, but back in the 80s, there were people were reading all these choose your own adventure books. And we're not allowed to even use that term because it's trademarked, but I can say choose your own adventure type, I suppose. But anyway, I decided I wanted to make one just for fun about all the things that can go wrong when you're simply trying to get up, make breakfast, get the kids to school, with all the things that they're supposed to remember, and you've run out of ink for your printer cartridge. And this actually started in the days before you could just order stuff online, before there were mobile phones, so it's a slightly different world. But anyway, I started putting it together just as a text-based project, and it kind of went on the back shelf for a while. And then I started drawing, and I started making comics, and I thought, aha, that's a way to do it. So I just started over. I took the whole thing and reframed it all as a page to each of the situations, and then having to turn to another page to find, what you've chosen to do next. And everything in there is based on bad things that I've done or that have happened to me. Not all in one day, I hasten to add. But yeah, getting on a train without your wallet, everything in there.
Yeah.
has happened in one form or another. And yeah, that was a lot of fun to make. Really hard. Boy, it was post-it notes all over the back of the door kind of thing, and working out the patterns, the flow.
So let's talk about your book projects. You have two exciting projects. The first project is a cookbook project, and your book, DIY Vegan Cooking, will be published later this fall.
Yes.
So tell us about this book.
Okay, well, this is the offshoot, really, of that very first thing I did in 2013. Having, done a little black and white version and then a color version, I then showed that color version to a publisher, and he was very keen on it. So, yeah, I got a book deal to make that into a proper book with about 50 recipes in it. And in the end, it's actually changed from a book to what I like to think of as a book without a binding. It's now a set of recipe cards in a special presentation box, which will be, really handy for cooking with, and you could even take it shopping, to see the ingredients. But the way these recipes work is each recipe, and I kind of don't even like to call them recipes, the recipe ideas, because wherever possible, I'm very non-prescriptive in both the amounts, and I encourage people to just swap the ingredients for what they really like. But at one glance, you see the entire meal, the entire dish being produced. It's not step by step in terms of different panels. The way, I have seen instruction, visual instructions like that, but this is at one glance you see the whole structure of the cooking. So things will be flying into a saucepan, and then something else will be happening over to the right that then gets added to the saucepan, and maybe the whole thing then goes down and gets dumped into a baking tray. But at one glance you can see everything that needs to happen. And I try to draw each ingredient only once to keep it simple like that. So to me, this is an absolutely perfect example of how visuals can take something that is seemingly complicated, which on a recipe, a normal written recipe, might take quite a few paragraphs. And you're always checking back to see how many grams was that, and when am I supposed to put that in, and where did the carrots go? So here, it just, at one glance, and you see it. It will come out in September in both the UK and the US, which is great. So I'm really looking forward to that. And And it's called DIY Vegan Cooking, because I really encourage people to make it their own. A lot of them are recipes that I just invented when I didn't know what to cook for dinner. And I thought, well, that was a bit good. And so I would write it down or sketch it on the back of an envelope, more likely. So, yeah, that's one project. Now, the other project that you kindly mentioned is my graphic novel.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. And this is just wild. It is a book about cycling and camping.
Yes.
Right? And it's a true story and a history project all rolled into one.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
It's like a travelogue. It's like going back in time to the Victorian era. It's about camping. It's about cycling. It's the true story of the man that actually invented the whole concept of camping by bicycle, or what some people call it bike packing now. That's a recent term I've heard, but I think of it as cycle camping. And it was written, when I say it was written, I'm basing this all on a book that was written by T.H. Holding in 1897. And he's amazing. He had the idea to actually do this in the summer of that year. And by December, he had written this book of about 232 pages. And he went on to start up a club which has evolved into today's camping and caravanning club, which in the UK is the major, camping and caravanning club. That's like it says on the tin. So it's an unbroken chain from 1901 to today, with a few different name changes along the way. So I just really wanted to bring this story to life. It's written in really archaic Old English, of course, being the 1800s. And he also has his own turn of phrase, which I think is quite funny, very didactic, extremely, it's himself. So I saved the tone of his own voice by using nothing but his words. And that's quite a constraint, in a way. Naturally, I'm not using all of them, or the thing would be 3,000 pages long. But I've taken all the bits that could work as a graphic novel, all the little bits of conversation, anything that's descriptive enough, just everything that I thought would work as a story.
And what makes those passages, those excerpts, work for a graphic novel? What makes them a potential part of the story?
I was going to say they have to evoke some kind of visual in your mind, but that's not really true, because that's my job as the drawing half. Basically, well, here's the thing. When I first got my hands on this book, my first thought was, I'm going to republish this because it's so long out of copyright. And it's a story that really I want the world to know much more. But as I thought about it, I thought, most people are just not going to read this because it is just so very, very long. And it goes into maybe more detail than you strictly need on descriptions of scenery and things like that. Yeah, it's hard to say. It took a long time. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. It took a very, very long time to actually choose what to use. I photocopied the entire book, and then I took a yellow highlighter and went through it, just marking the passages that jumped out at me. And it's kind of an unusual graphic novel or long-form comic in that it doesn't have your traditional story arc where you've got a problem and then it gets solved, because, or in a way it does, but without the usual. It's not a hero's journey kind of book, let's put it that way. They try out this idea and they succeed. And along the way, here's part of what had to be included, actually. T.H. Holding had a lot of very strong opinions about things, which really come across quite forcefully in the book. And he's very tongue-in-cheek about all sorts of things, and it really shows his personality. And to make it more than just four men on bicycles cycling around rural Ireland, it had to include a lot of the I don't want to say background details, just more of social details. Where every time they meet people or they stop at farmhouses to buy eggs or bread or ask to pitch their tent, all the interactions with people, everything that sort of brings it to life as a kind of social history, because I find that part really fascinating as much as the cycle camping part, which I love because I've done both of those things a lot in the past. But just knocking at the door of a cottage and finding that the cattle are in the same room as the people, because that's how people lived in the country. All these things I just mentioned, almost like they're normal, and I'd like to bring that across to just make it seem like it's 1897. And you wouldn't believe the amount of ridiculous research that has gone into this thing. The detail, everything I draw, whether it's tin openers or barometers or, what they're wearing, the street scenes, everything has to be 1897. So I'm spending a lot of time on Google Images. Google Street View has been a godsend because I can literally, well, not literally, that's a little bit incorrect. Well, yes, I can. I can literally follow the route that they had taken, creeping along on Street View, seeing more or less the same scenes. You can tell, what's been there for 120 years and what's brand new. At least the mountains are old, So, yeah, sorry, I could bang on and on about this. I'm so excited about this project, but unfortunately it's taken, I hate to say it, but it's been 4 years so far, and it's not anywhere close to done.
Yeah.
But
yeah, well, you said this is a monster history project. It is to me, it's a very fine example of heritage interpretation. As a graphic novel, as a graphic story.
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, what I love about it is I want to shine a light on T.H. Holding because he was a huge influence. I think they were so innovative. They got by with so little, and they just, invented and made do. They had 4 men sleeping in a tent, which is 6 feet by 6 foot. People these days just would not put up with that kind of thing, It's a different world.
No, camping tents are just so elaborate these days with like a front room and then the sleeping quarters and...
Yeah, and armchairs and all the rest of it. Yeah. But, it's primitive. So I think this also appeals to people that like basic sort of, what do you call primitive camping? There's another word for it. That's not quite the right word. But, just kind of basic wild camping. So...
Yes, backcountry camping.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just really feel like it's a story that needs to be told.
Yeah, this is wonderful. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. Well, I will. I am working on it. I really am. Just very slowly at times.
Yeah. Now, for your projects, you have also established a Patreon page, right? To keep people updated about your projects?
Yes, I have. It goes into some of this very geeky detail of working out, for people that are really interested in what, really going behind the scenes and what it takes to, figure out. Sometimes I'm talking about figuring out the language he's used, funny words and, how long it took to actually figure out what he meant and, what I ought to draw for that page or figure out how to match the visuals to the words or, all kinds of things, just the details of physically producing the graphic novel. And I've actually got 2 separate sides to the Patreon. The other side is for the people that are mostly interested in the graphic recipes. And I would put up drafts of those and ask for comments. People could try them out and let me know if they work, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. Wonderful. There are a lot of people listening who are involved in science education and who may already use zines in some part of their work or maybe not. Or your work might have probably most likely have turned them all on into exploring this aspect, this format as a teaching tool. how would you encourage teachers and educators who work in informal learning environments and engage with the public directly, not a specific grade, say, how might you encourage them or advise them to step into exploring this genre?
One thing that I think is really effective is actually getting kids to draw as they're learning. There's a whole field called sketchnoting, which is kind of related in a way to graphic recording, but sketchnoting is something that you do for yourself. And it's been shown that writing stuff down with more than words, in other words, putting it down with images and symbols and arrows, showing the relation, whatever, really helps with the learning for an awful lot of people. So I think that's something that kids can start doing at any age, really, once they're shown how or encouraged to. Aside from that, I think, there are more and more of these long-form comics or even short comics about all kinds of subjects, history, like you mentioned, science, philosophy. It's out there. Find it, use it. It's fantastic stuff. And I think we're almost in another golden age of comics, it seems like, where people are really appreciating how effective these can be for telling stories and getting information across. So, yeah, definitely just worth a try.
Mm-hmm. Yes. When you look over your shoulder and look back on the trail you've left behind, what do you see?
Ooh, what my own trail? Well, okay. What I see is somebody that wasn't drawing at all a very short time ago, really. And I was making jewelry for a while, so I wasn't entirely not artistic at all, but I also spent a lot of time renovating houses, and I was, doing environmental work in Japan and playing in bands and, everything else but drawing. And what really turned it around for me was this trying out those recipes, trying out the recipe idea. I think I'd always sort of sketched on the back of an envelope when I was cooking. I would interpret a written recipe into scribbles. So that was already how I did things. But I would say just starting without having any idea what was going to happen has just led to the most surprising and wonderful progression that I could not have predicted. And I would really say, yeah, just start, especially. And I also have to give thanks to all kinds of communities that I belong to, because I think that really, really helps. That's not something that I would have known at the beginning, especially if you're doing something a little bit out of the ordinary, a little bit odd. Having other people around that think that's normal. it normalizes things. It encourages you. Like, I used to be a long-distance runner. Well, let me put that another way. Let's pretend I'm still a long-distance runner. I'm just a little bit lapsed. I'll say that. But hanging out with other people to whom running marathons and more was normal made it seem like I could do that. And indeed I could. But if I'd just been on my own, I think I probably just wouldn't have, occurred to me. And so it's the same with the comics and the drawing. I belong to, quite a few online communities of different sorts, formal, informal, sort of a paid group of creatives, informal groups of just friends, working on, whether it's drawing or whether it's comics related. And even as a total introvert, which I am, I find the community aspect really, really inspiring. And it kind of keeps you going to have that support and other examples and encouragement.
What's next for you?
Ooh, what's next? At the moment, I'm working on a lovely illustration job for someone. I'm just finishing this one up. Someone who does a term I had been unaware of until very recently: social emotional learning, all to do with movement and your nervous system and arts, all tied together. She's a leading light in this area, and I'm doing a whole bunch of illustrations for her on that, which is lovely. And that's just an example of something that I'm learning about as I go along. So you never know what the next learning is going to be. It's all quite fun. I'd like to say the next thing is I'm going to get this graphic novel finished and out there, maybe this year. Yeah, it's still early, isn't it? We've got a few months left. Get the draft done and then start on the inking and the coloring. No, I'm just really happy to be finding more and more really cool illustration jobs to keep me going, and to be working on my own projects.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for the wonderful things that you've taught us through your work, which people can see on your website. You do a really nice job showing your work and providing updates about current projects and past projects, and providing examples of the types of work that you do. And also, I'd like to tell listeners that your book about the free day in the life of a freelancer, that's in your shop, and there are links to different examples of your work, and so it's all wonderful. So, well, thank you, Michi, for being here today and for teaching us. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed learning more about your process, more about your story, and thank you for the work that you do.
Well, thank you so much, Tania, and thank you for the work that you do. This is really, it's never been so important as it is now. I mean, it's something that I've always been interested in since my earliest childhood that I can remember, was environment, and to be able to do something to help at this stage, visually is very fulfilling for me, and it's wonderful to see all the work that's being done.
To learn more about Michi, to view examples of her work, and to see her current projects, visit the show notes for this episode at talaterra.com. Here you will also find links to other resources mentioned during our conversation. And if you begin your own nature-related comic strip or graphic novel, let us know. We'd love to hear about your project. Talaterra is a podcast for and about independent educators working in natural resource fields and environmental education. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Tania Marien.